Every Saturday at 9 o'clock a.m., Margaret Maggie Hayes arrived at Larkin's Café, a small coffee shop tucked between a laundromat and a flower shop on the edge of town. At 61, Maggie moved differently from most. A spinal injury sustained in the line of duty left her permanently wheelchair-bound, but she refused to let it define her. She didn't come to the cafe out of habit. She came for quiet, to write in her weathered leather journal, to sip strong coffee, and to feel like part of the world, even if only from the corner of a noisy room. That Saturday, the cafe was unusually crowded. The weather had just turned warm, and every table seemed filled with chattering weekenders. As Maggie pushed herself up the ramp and toward the front door, a group of young adults sitting near the window caught sight of her. One of them, a woman in heels, glanced at her and then looked away, reaching quickly for her phone. No one got up. No one held the door. Maggie struggled to push the heavy glass door open on her own. She used one arm to brace the wheel, the other to grip the handle. Her forearms strained, jaw clenched. After a long pause and awkward angle, she got through. Inside, not a single person acknowledged her effort. The barista behind the counter offered a flat smile. "Morning. You can grab a seat wherever." Maggie nodded politely and wheeled herself toward the back, weaving carefully between chairs that hadn't been pushed in. She maneuvered to her usual table, the only one with enough space for her chair, only to find it partially blocked by a mop bucket and stacked boxes. She hesitated. A young waitress named Ellie noticed, but didn't move. She looked nervous, glanced toward her manager, then back at Maggie, and returned to clearing dishes instead. Maggie didn't complain. She just turned and rolled to the window, settling for a corner with limited room, careful not to bump other guests. At the counter, while waiting for her Americano, Maggie overheard a woman mutter to her friend, "I don't understand why people like that insist on coming to places like this. It's not like it's easy for anyone." Maggie's eyes didn't flicker. She simply took her cup, returned to her table, and opened her journal. She had faced worse in war zones, mortar fire, triage under gunfire, carrying wounded men through muddy fields. But somehow, being invisible in a crowded cafe stung deeper than anything she'd expected. Still, she sat with dignity, quiet, unshaken. But what the cafe didn't know was that this Saturday was different. Today was a reunion, and her unit was coming. Maggie Hayes had long grown used to silence. The quiet glances, the awkward shifts in conversation, the way people looked through her. Not at her, but that Saturday the silence didn't last. It started with a hiss from the espresso machine, then the unmistakable voice of a man just one table over. "Bet she parks in a veteran spot too," he muttered. Low, but not low enough. His friend snorted. "What's she gonna do, deploy her wheels into combat?" Laughter followed, not loud but sharp, controlled mockery, the kind that hits harder because it wears the disguise of humor. Maggie said nothing. Her eyes stayed on the page of her journal, but her hand, the one holding the pen, paused ever so slightly. A few tables away, a young boy looked up from his muffin. "Dad, why are they making fun of her?" he asked innocently. His father shushed him quickly, glancing around, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. The moment passed like fog creeping across a window, present but unspoken. Maggie resumed writing. "They always whisper first, then they assume, then they forget they're speaking out loud." At the counter, Ellie, the young waitress, clenched her jaw as she wiped down a tray. She had worked at Larkin's for almost a year. She had seen Maggie dozens of times, always alone, always composed, always tipped well, even when her drink was lukewarm or her corner forgotten. Ellie took a step toward Maggie's table, coffee pot in hand, but the manager, a man named Rick, raised an eyebrow at her from behind the bar. Ellie hesitated. She turned away. At that moment, Maggie reached to grab a napkin and accidentally nudged the corner of her tray. Her cup rattled and tipped, splashing lukewarm coffee across the table. She moved quickly, grabbing a few napkins with practiced calm, dabbing the spill, still quiet, still composed. From behind her, the voice returned. "Should we get her a bib?" Maggie froze for just a second, not long, but long enough for Ellie, still watching, to see it. The table of mockers chuckled again. "She probably tells people she was in the military," one of them added. Bet she never even left base. Probably wore scrubs and took blood pressure while the real soldiers fought. Another woman at the counter, middle-aged, sipping tea, shook her head and muttered, "This country gives medals to anyone these days." No one stopped them. No one stood up. No one even made eye contact with Maggie, who had quietly finished wiping her table and returned to her writing, her back straight, her hands calm, her face unreadable. But inside her chest, a familiar feeling was rising, the one she used to feel before a mass casualty arrived at the field hospital, the stillness before the noise. Because they didn't know. They didn't know who she was. They didn't know what she'd done, and they didn't know that in exactly 10 minutes, the cafe doors would open again. And this time, someone else would speak. At precisely 9:55 a.m., the front door of Larkin's Cafe opened. The bell above the frame gave its usual cheerful ring, but what entered was not the usual morning crowd. 8 men and women walked in, one after another. Their movements were precise, their backs straight, their pace measured. Not hurried, not slow. Some wore old military jackets. Others wore civilian clothes with patches on the sleeves or pins tucked subtly on their collars. None of them needed to raise their voice. They carried presence. They carried memory. They carried the weight of something the rest of the cafe had clearly forgotten. At the center was Staff Sergeant Alex Rivera, now in his 50s, broad-shouldered, salt in his beard, and still every inch a leader. He scanned the cafe, then gave a small nod to the others. They walked in formation, not rigid, but unmistakable. The laughter from the mocking table stopped mid-chuckle. Rick, the manager, blinked, visibly uncertain. The young boy who had asked about Maggie earlier turned in his seat and whispered, "Dad, are they soldiers?" They were more than that. They were her unit, the same team Maggie had served with in Kandahar, where she had pulled half of them from collapsed bunkers and kept the rest breathing through dust, blood, and chaos. It had been 20 years. Some had left the military, some still served, but once a month on the last Saturday they met. Not always all of them, but today they came for her. Alex stepped forward toward Maggie's table. She looked up slowly, eyes narrowing as recognition flickered across her face. Not surprise, not disbelief, just a soft warmth that pulled at the corners of her mouth. "Sergeant Hayes," Alex said, voice loud enough to fill the cafe, but quiet enough to carry respect. "Permission to report for breakfast, ma'am?" The entire cafe went still. You could hear a fork drop. One of the women behind him, a special Lieutenant Marcy Toe, pulled a folded, creased letter from her coat. "We still carry this," she said, placing it on Maggie's table. "The note you wrote when you saved Torres. None of us ever forgot what you did." Another unit member carefully pulled out an old photo. Maggie, younger, in uniform, sleeves rolled up, arms covered in dust and blood, kneeling beside a wounded Marine. Ellie, the waitress, froze in the middle of pouring coffee. Rick, the manager, shifted uncomfortably behind the counter, now realizing the gravity of what had just entered his cafe. One of the mocking men at the next table tried to speak, but couldn't, because the truth now stood in front of them, not just in uniforms, not just in medals or patches, but in the quiet way every single one of these people looked at Maggie Hayes, as someone who led, someone who bled, someone who carried them through the fire. Alex stood tall, turned toward the rest of the room and said, "You don't have to know someone's story to treat them with respect, but sometimes you forget, and they end up being the reason you're still here." Then he turned back to Maggie and added, "We remember, Sergeant, and we're here to stand with you." The boy at the counter clapped, once, then again. His father joined, and slowly, awkwardly at first, the cafe filled with the soft sound of clapping. Not applause, something quieter, something earned. Maggie looked at her team, tears in her eyes. "You're late," she said, with a smile that cracked the silence. Alex smirked. "Ma'am, traffic in this town's a war zone." They all laughed. And just like that, the air in the cafe changed. For a few long seconds after the unit's arrival, no one moved. The cafe, moments ago buzzing with chatter and coffee machines, now stood in reverent stillness. The table of mockers sat frozen. One of the men reached for his phone, then quietly slid it into his pocket. Another stared into his half-finished latte, suddenly far more interested in the foam than the people around him. Maggie's unit began pulling chairs around her table. They didn't ask. They didn't need to. Each one greeted her with a nod, a pat on the shoulder, a soft ma'am. Ellie, the waitress, quickly cleared space and brought over extra cups. Her hands trembled slightly, not from nerves but from a mixture of shame and respect. The young boy from earlier stood up, walked to Maggie's table with slow steps, and stopped right in front of her. "Are you really a hero?" he asked, his voice honest and wide-eyed. Maggie smiled gently. "No," she said. "I was just a medic who stayed calm when things got loud." "But they're all here for you," the boy said, pointing to the unit. "They're here because we went through something together," she replied. "And when you go through the worst parts of life with someone, you never forget." The boy nodded seriously, then turned and looked at his dad. "Can I sit with her?" Maggie's team made space immediately. At the counter, Rick, the manager, emerged from the back. His face had lost its usual managerial detachment. He walked up to Maggie's table, clearing his throat. "Sergeant Hayes, I want to apologize," he said, "for the way the way we treated you." Maggie looked up at him. "You didn't say the words," she said plainly. "No," he admitted, "but I also didn't stop the ones who did." She didn't respond right away. Then she said, "You can't change what people say, but you can change what you allow." Rick nodded, humbled. "From now on, this table's yours, no charge. Ever." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "I'm not here for charity." "No," he said. "You're here for coffee. I'm offering gratitude." One of her team members, Marcy, stood up and addressed the entire room. "We know she won't say it, but this woman dragged two of us out of a collapsed barrack under mortar fire. She stitched a third, went with a shoelace and morphine. She stayed awake for 3 days once, so none of us bled out. You don't have to like her coffee order, but you will respect her presence." The room stayed silent, but something had shifted, not out of guilt, but out of awareness. Maggie wasn't just a woman in a wheelchair anymore. She was someone who had carried others when they couldn't walk. And now those people had come to carry her presence forward. And in that little cafe, where she had once been invisible, she had now become unmissable. The following Saturday, when Maggie Hayes returned to Larkin's Café, something was different. There was no mop bucket by the wall, no boxes cluttering the corner, and above her usual table, now freshly polished and placed near the window, hung a small brass plaque. Its inscription was simple: "Reserved for Sergeant Maggie Hayes. She carried us all." Maggie stopped in the doorway and read it without expression. Then she slowly rolled forward and took her place beneath it, like she had so many times before, only this time without the weight of being unseen. Rick approached with a fresh cup of coffee already in hand. No words, just a quiet nod of respect. Maggie nodded back. That morning she didn't sit alone. One by one, members of her old unit returned. Some came in uniform, some brought spouses or kids, some brought photos, letters, stories. And slowly, others in the cafe, the ones who had once looked away, began to stop by. A young barista left a small flower beside her cup. A mother brought her daughter over to thank Maggie for her service and for her silence. Even the mocking men returned one day. One of them approached awkwardly, hat in hand. "My brother served in Iraq," he said. "I think he would have wanted me to say sorry for all of it." Maggie didn't offer a speech. She simply looked him in the eye and replied, "Then go say it to someone else before it's too late." He nodded and left, quieter than he'd arrived. Over the next few weeks, the corner booth became something more than furniture. It became a landmark, a small, quiet place of remembrance, not of war, but of service, of the kind of bravery that doesn't shout. Maggie still wrote in her journal, still sipped her Americano. But now, when she looked up, there were always eyes that met hers, not with pity, but with respect. And sometimes, just sometimes, a young stranger would ask, "Can you tell me what it was like?" And Maggie, hands folded, voice calm, would begin, "No, but I can tell you why I stayed." If this story touched your heart, we'd be honored to have you with us. Each day we share quiet moments that remind us what still matters. You can subscribe below to join us.